I'm privileged to have Patrick Nurre here. Patrick is a geologist from the time he was very young, as you'll find out, and he does a lot of teaching on geology, mostly to homeschool kids right now. Patrick and his wife have founded the Northwest Treasures, and that's his main organization, and he's got books and presentations that he makes available from his website. You'll want to take advantage of it and look at some of that. Patrick is a very popular speaker at homeschool conventions. Obviously, he hasn't done much of that this year because the homeschool conventions of everything has gone online. And so Patrick has adjusted what he does by offering his courses online as well, and I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit about that. The other thing he does is he does lead field trips to Yellowstone and some other national parks. And so he's an expert on these parks, and this evening he's going to speak about the geology of 3 of the parks that are available to us here in the Northwest. So Patrick, thank you.
Thanks, Heinz. Well, welcome to the Apologetics Forum of Snohomish County. I'm glad that for all you who are tuning in, and tonight we're going to look at the subject of interpreting the geology of our national parks. How do we do that? Well, you might have a question here. Why do we need to interpret the geology of our national parks? I thought geology was a science. And of course, if there's science, I mean, that settles the question. That settles the issue. You can't interpret science. Science deals with facts and observation. But I learned a long time ago that geology is part science and part something else. Years ago, I learned this passage of Scripture has stayed with me for many, many years, and it goes like this: "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses." Now, he's not talking about material and physical fortresses. It says we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. Of course, to us as Christians, the knowledge of God has been preserved in the Scriptures. And so when we find disagreement or conflict between the Scriptures and, of course, what scientists do say, then we have to look at that. Are we dealing with science or are we dealing with something else? So what I have discovered through the years is this: modern Earth history is in direct opposition to the knowledge of God on a number of issues. We're not talking about the science within geology. There's no disagreement when we talk about the science in geology. When we look at the rocks and identify the minerals in the rocks, we can identify the rocks in the rock layers. We can identify most of the fossil specimens and so on. That's the science of it. But the origin of that stuff is something that has not been observed. So we interpret that. And of course, we interpret that in light of frameworks that we've set up to do that. And that's what I'd kind of like to define and apply tonight as we look at those 3 national parks we're going to look at. And I think it's appropriate here to start out by defining a few words. And these are things that I try to keep focused when I'm dealing especially with Earth history and Earth science. Here's the first one. Science is that which is observable, testable, and repeatable. If it's that, there's no question that is science, and we agree with the science. It's observable, testable, and repeatable. Now, when we look at geology, the word means the study of the earth, and it involves 2 parts: earth science and earth history. And earth history is not the same thing as earth science. Those are two completely different subjects. The problem that has arisen over the years is that we've tended to combine those two together, and we teach them as one discipline subject. And a lot of confusion comes about because of that, because Earth history is a totally different subject than Earth science. A second word we want to define here is the word history. It deals with unique, one-time events supported by eyewitness accounts and historical records. Now, it's at this point the Bible is just such a document. We don't have that in geology. What we have in geology are the things that we can observe and the things that we haven't observed. There is no written history. Now, some geologists have claimed that the rocks are the written history, but that is not the same thing. The history of the earth has been interpreted. So the Bible, though, is a historical document, and it deserves to be treated in that fashion. A second or a third word we need to define is the word philosophy, and it means the interpretation of evidence. This involved guesses and ideas about things that you see. Now, here, many scientists, and many don't know that they're confusing this. Many have confused their interpretation of the evidence with science. And that is a very big hurdle to overcome. We've got to see the difference between what is the science and what is the interpretation of the evidence that we're observing. Modern geology consists of some science and a whole lot of interpretation. I've read over 100 secular books on the topic of geology. And I can tell you that every book has some differences in how they interpret the history of things. And these have been all great geologists through the years. The science has stayed the same, but it's the interpretation of the evidence that shifts from generation to generation. A fourth word we need to define is the word consensus. It's really group agreement by powerful people. And consensus may or may not be science. I'm sure we've all run into that. There can be several instances of this where consensus has turned out to be the wrong direction or the wrong thing. And that is oftentimes confused with the science. But it's hard to fight against that. And in many cases, those who disagree with a consensus are labeled as science deniers, when in fact they're consensus deniers, is really what's going on with that. So again, if we're going to not only teach our kids, but ourselves become critical thinkers, we've got to think about what we're doing here and watch the way we label certain things. So what I want to do is take this approach and look at the geology that built the secular framework for interpreting our national parks. It's been a great system. Our national parks here in the United States is second to none. I've been to several national parks in Israel, and they're all modeled on the idea of the United States national park system, but it doesn't come close. And so a wonderful thing that we've done, probably one of the best ideas in American history, has been the establishment of the national park system. And they've done a very good job of protecting and organizing the features for everybody to see. So what has been a short history here of how we interpret, secularly anyway, the national parks. And I think it really began in 1797. This man moved the bar for understanding geology. His famous book called The Theory of the Earth. This was James Hutton, considered now to be the father of modern geology. And he taught this. The geological history of the earth was the result of slow gradual and uniform geological processes throughout time. Now, that was quite a shocker, because up until that time, the great geologists all used the book of Genesis as the framework for interpreting the rocks and the fossils that they were finding. This was called, for a long time, the New Geology, in contrast to what had been the model for many, many years. In the 1830s, this man, Charles Lyell, drove the European world into the new geology with his groundbreaking 3-volume series, Principles of Geology. And they're still in print, and they're still used in college courses today. Lyell had such an influence on the geologists of the day and among the universities that in 1859, Charles Darwin, so influenced by reading some of Lyell's books, published his book, It Shook the World, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And his ideas really came together as a result of what Charles Lyell had to say. Shortly after Charles Darwin, a person who became a very good friend and a supporter of Darwin by the name of Thomas Huxley, he showed up, and he's called Darwin's bulldog, tenaciously defended Darwinism. He was also nicknamed the Bishop Eater. And you can just imagine where he got that name. He loved to debate church leaders, set them up and then destroy them. I mean, that was his occupation, I think his game. He loved doing that. But a biologist and convinced that Darwinism was the only way to look at life and development of life on Earth. In 1861, this particular fossil here you're looking at, fossil feather, was found in Bavaria. It was named Archaeopteryx, meaning ancient wing, and dated 150 million years old. Huxley quickly proclaimed that this was a transitional form, believing that dinosaurs evolved into birds. Now, for some reason, that really shook the church world. And as I have looked over the history of that, it's always puzzled me why that was so. It's a very easy thing to see what the scriptures taught about birds and about land animals. Of course, dinosaurs have always been considered to be land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. And so if you look in the scripture, all the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals were created on day 6 of the creation week. Birds, however, were created on day 5. So according to the scriptural framework, it really is the other way around. Dinosaurs did not evolve into birds. Birds existed before dinosaurs. And so that would have been a relatively easy thing to embrace had you really known it. And that's been the problem throughout church history. Very few believers know their scriptures well enough to see some of these things that have gone on and that continue to go on, which is a good lesson for us. Know the scriptures. That is our framework as believers. This particular person, John Wesley Powell, very famous geologist, is a Civil War veteran. You can see he lost his right arm. Became the first white person to explore the Colorado River in 1869. And he concluded that the Grand Canyon was 70 million years old. Quite a brave person to be rafting down the Colorado River with one arm. And in wooden boats. They didn't have these big rubber rafts then. This was pretty brave, and he was quite an adventurer. But his ideas for the Grand Canyon have pretty much stuck. There have been several books written about the origin of the Grand Canyon, but the one that everybody keeps coming back to deals with the age that John Wesley Powell first advocated for. In 1871, this man, Ferdinand Hayden, led the first U.S. authorized expedition of the region known as the Yellowstone. The region became Yellowstone National Park in 1872 as a result of his collection of evidence, research, and so on. Hayden had been trained in the new geology. A very funny story I like to include here about Hayden. He was known for picking up rocks wherever he went. In fact, the quartermaster used to complain about him all the time on these expeditions because he'd take stuff out of the wagons and load the wagons up with rocks and other artifacts that he would pick up along the way. Well, one day he was out collecting, had several bags of rocks, and he ran into the Cheyenne Indians. Now, the Cheyenne Indians this was the time when they were building up resistance to the Army. And of course, in 1876, you've got the defeat of Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And that involved the Cheyenne Indians. So they were not exactly tame during this time. And he ran into a party of these Cheyenne Indians, and they demanded to know what he was carrying in his bags. They ordered him to drop the stuff out of his bag, empty his bags. And so as he did, of course, all these rocks came out of his bags. Now, one of the things that saved his life that day was that the Cheyenne Indians had superstitions about killing insane people. They wouldn't do it, and so they let him live. They thought he had some pretty nasty spirits within him, and so they kept away from him. But they gave him this name, and I'm sure the soldiers had a good laugh about it, but he was named He Who Runs Around Picking Up Stones. That was his name given to him by the Cheyenne Indians. The Hayden expedition of 1871, of course, sparked a whole new quest for exploring the West. And in fact, the reports that started coming back from this expedition just fired the imagination of people. The area of the Yellowstone was not very well understood during this time. And in fact, in the 1870s, I think the population of the Montana Territory was still only about 700 people. And that, of course, doesn't include all the Native Americans that were there, but it was a very sparse place. And primarily people went out there, of course, went out there for gold. One of the quests that came about as a result of all of this was the Bone Wars of 1875 to 1898. Again, a couple of very brave men who were fossil hunting up in the Montana Territory right around the time the Indians were finishing Custer off. So they had some guts to go up into that area. But the big dinosaur bones, just, of course, they sparked the imagination and the quest for owning these things. I mean, no one had ever seen beasts this big, and they were shipping these things back by wagons, and it was quite a thing. But one of the guys' name was O.C. Marsh there on the left, and then there's Edward Drinker Cope, kind of an unfortunate name, but that was his name. The two of them were both trained in the new geology. Between them, they named 150 new species of dinosaurs, so you can see how devoted they were to this thing. They were carting off boxes and boxes of bones. In fact, when Marsh died in the late 1800s, he died with several train cars full of unopened boxes of fossils. Now, all these geologists had one thing in common. They were all educated in the uniformitarian framework of understanding geology. As far as we know, none of them expressed an interest in or a knowledge of the book of Genesis. In fact, I can find very few men who embrace the straightforward view of Genesis. There are a few. They were mostly pastors and lay geologists, but they remained faithful to the straightforward rendering of Scripture. But they weren't big, and they weren't really influential all that much. And this is a sad commentary because when you think about it, Genesis is a historical account of what happened at the creation, the flood, and Joseph in Egypt, covering about the first 2,000 years of Earth history. Why wouldn't you pay attention to that history and at least see whether it fits a view of interpreting the various wonders we were discovering? The framework for interpreting the natural wonders in our national parks today is entirely uniformitarian. And it is a belief that geological processes have operated in uniform ways and rates throughout Earth history. At the heart of modern geology is a rejection of anything to do with the supernatural creation and the global catastrophic flood. Science somehow became identified with a rejection of this kind of stuff. And there's really no reason for it. If you see science as a separate subject and history as a separate subject, then the biblical account, of course, fits with the historical understanding of Earth history. This framework has been modified today and renamed actualism. The past must be deciphered only by actual observed processes operating today. There's a little phrase I learned from Gary Parker a number of years ago. He used to help simplify the idea of uniformitarianism, and that is small and slow and long ago. Kids really identify with this, and they can memorize poetry pretty quickly. So rather than having them try to figure out how many letters uniformitarianism has in it, they can quickly identify the word with small and slow and long ago. We're talking about small geological process steps operating over a long period of time throughout the remote past. It was coined by this guy here, Alfred Romer, a very popular paleontologist. It's one of the books I have read called Vertebrate Paleontology. Alfred Romer, very, very famous in his day, and he modified uniformitarianism quite a bit. Modern geology was developed under the influence of the Enlightenment and the religion called deism. It's very interesting when I teach kids, and I teach several hundred kids a year. I'll ask them, what can you tell me about the Enlightenment and about deism? And they will look at me like it's a foreign concept. Very few kids study the effects of the Enlightenment on the development of deism and the influence it had on the thinkers of the 1800s. Very few of them know it. And they have no idea what took place then. But here's what the Enlightenment really embraced. They rejected the supernatural. There was no divine involvement and no miracles. They rejected the scriptures as divine and relevant. And they rejected the Genesis account of creation and the flood. Now that sets the whole bar for the interpretation, the secular interpretation of the geology of our national parks. And the first one I'd like to just look at is the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. Quite a place. Initially, it was protected as a national monument in 1906 under Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a real friend of the national park system and did all he could to advance the cause. He was quite a naturalist and spent lots of his time in these places. He used the Antiquities Act at the time to set aside the area as protected land. Finally became a national park in 1962, so quite a few years later. Now here's what the secular view of Petrified Forest is. The Petrified Forest is known for its fallen fossil trees that live there in Arizona in the late Triassic period, about 225 million years ago. So that's a general summary of how they view that. So, well, what is the Triassic period? Well, it's a period that occurred between 252 and 201 million years ago. And it reflects the belief that these animals you see here were the primitive and now extinct precursors to the dinosaurs. Of course, if you jog your memory a little bit as a kid, you remember the Mesozoic era, the Triassic, Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. Those are very popular with kids. It's about the only thing of the geologic timetable they can remember. Anything to do with dinosaurs, they're all in. And that was the Triassic period, according to secular view. Here are some questions, though. As you wander through this area known as the Petrified Forest, here are some questions we ought to be asking. One is, how do we know that these trees and animals actually lived in this place we're looking at, which is now Arizona? Another question, does this collection of petrified wood and fossil animals represent an actual forest? There are no trees standing there as if the forest was living there. These are all logs just broken up and scattered all over the place, quite an extensive amount. Number three, how did so many trees become petrified? So you can talk about the petrification of one tree or a piece of wood, but a whole bunch of wood uniformly petrified, that raises some real questions. And then the last question is, how do we know that these petrified logs are 225 million years old? Now, today we kind of have this perspective that radiometric dating solves all of the problems of the world, when in fact radiometric dating didn't start to exist as a dating system until the first radioactive clock was developed back in 1912. And all these ages were being set a long time before that. At any rate, the ages were set for the Triassic period, and before radiometric dating came along. So that poses then the question, how did they come up with these ages? These questions are difficult to answer within the uniformitarian framework. And again, if we do some just simple observation, we know that the present modern day floods and changing topography move things around a lot. All you need to do is to read through Lewis and Clark Journal of the Core of Discovery and all the maps that they drew of where rivers ran, points of interest, and so on. According to modern maps, those have all changed. Bends have changed. Areas they described have changed quite a bit geographically. It's just part and parcel of changing landscape. And yet these trees are supposed to have lived there in this area 225 million years ago. And these are the remnants. Well, it's pretty hard to demonstrate that using the uniformitarian framework. Natural petrification today in our present world is extremely rare. I don't know of anybody who has actually seen this happen naturally. There have been some experiments done with dangling wood in the geysers there, or the hot springs at Yellowstone. Of course, the one thing Yellowstone has, Yellowstone Park, is the hot springs are filled with silica, and that forms the geyserite, that white stuff all around the basins in Yellowstone that you see. That stuff is all quartz. And that would make sense, because what you're dealing with here with this wood is they're all infiltrated by quartz. So that's about the limit of our experience. We've done some laboratory work with petrification, turning wood, petrified wood, and turning wood into coal, but those are under very carefully controlled laboratory conditions. We've never seen anything like what we see at Petrified Forest. Fallen trees do not petrify. They decompose and disintegrate. When I lead these families on tours through Yellowstone, we walk through forests where trees have fallen and just sat there for years, and they are rotting. They're not petrifying. And kids pick up on that very, very quickly. So here are my observations about petrified forests. First of all, the wood is uniformly petrified, which to me speaks of one common event. Second of all, the petrification material is silica or quartz. I want to know where all of that came from. What's the source for all of the silica, the quartz? It's easy to see how wood could have been covered with blowing sand, but then the wood still is going to rot away. And sand has quartz in it. But these trees have been permineralized, which means mineral has spread throughout the tree and petrified it. The root balls are missing, indicating catastrophic transportation of sediments. The wood is broken up and strewn all around. And the topography consists of volcanic ash. Oh, there's a key to understanding where the silica came from. The ash is highly concentrated with quartz. It's very similar, Mount St. Helens. You know, there was a shop, I don't know if it's still operating, but there was a shop on the Toutle Highway there to going toward Mount St. Helens for a long time that was making Christmas decorations out of the ash. They would melt the glass and they'd make glass ornaments out of it. And that's what ash is. A lot of it's just glass. And so that certainly makes sense. Iron oxide deposits and eroded sandstone. Sandstone is another sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rocks are those laid down by water and mud. And the area is fairly uniform out there, the geographical area. So as there are no dates and no eyewitness accounts, the history of the fossils have to be interpreted. Now, it would be easy if the dates were stamped on the wood, on the fossils. That would make it very easy. We do that with coins. When we collect coins, we want to know what the dates are on them. That's how you collect your coins. But here, we don't have them. And there's really only two views that can serve as frameworks for interpreting these fossils. One, of course, is small and slow and long ago. Did it happen that way? The other one is this one, big and fast in the recent past. Now that describes the biblical view. The creation was big. The flood was big. And it was quick, it was fast. The flood lasted for about a year. And it really laid down all the rock layers that we see all around us. So that was big and fast, and it occurred in the recent past. Here's our basic biblical framework we're looking at, a period of 6,000 years, with a creation lasting 6 days with a day of rest, a pre-flood world lasting about 1656 years to the flood, and the flood lasting about a year, and then everything after the flood is the post-flood period. That's the period that we are in. That's the biblical historical framework. Now that's different than religion. This is a historical document and should be examined as such. So using our biblical framework, how would I interpret the area around Petrified Forest National Park? Well, trees torn up and transported and deposited. The sediments indicate an abundance of silica-rich volcanic ash. So I would put this event at some time toward the end of the Genesis flood and into the post-flood period. Would have been a lot of moving sediments, water rapidly throwing things around, trees rapidly petrifying because of the rich volcanic ash from the volcanism. Volcanism, as we'll see with Yellowstone, was quite significant during and for a while after the flood. Most of the big volcanic eruptions have all been dated secularly during a time that we would call post-flood. So that's simply what I would that's how I would do it. The petrified forest is really not a forest at all, but a deposit of petrified wood and fossils of animals, and who knows where they were transported from. We just don't know that. Well, let's look at Yosemite National Park. Here, Yosemite is known for granite and the ice-carved icons of Yosemite. It's a wonderful place to visit. It's becoming one of the most crowded national parks in the country. If you want to see it, you really have to either drive through. There's literally no parking anywhere. You have to drive through, or you have to park your car outside and take their buses in and tour the park that way. There are really a lot of people that do attend or do explore Yosemite. Yosemite is located in eastern California, and it's America's third national park. It became a national park in 1894, but it was the first state park in the country. So a state park of California. It became protected land under Abraham Lincoln as early as 1864. So they were actively at work, primarily due to this man here, John Muir. Lived from 1838 to 1914. I don't know of any other person in the 1800s who was as energetic and prolific when it came to exploring primarily the western United States and the natural wonders. He was very prolific. In fact, some have described him this way: an influential Scottish-American naturalist, author, environmental philosopher, botanist, zoologist, and co-founder of the Sierra Club, and early advocate for the preservation of wilderness in the United States. Well, naturally, he would make a lot of people very nervous because there were a lot of people who were trying to set up commercial exploitation of these areas in California. And it was John Muir who primarily stood in their way. And in fact, he was an all-around pain in the hind end of Josiah Whitney, who was the chief of the California Geological Survey at the time. And a very famous controversy took place between John Muir and himself. John Muir was one of the most influential men of the 1800s. He was also known as John of the Mountains and father of the national parks. Here he's pictured with Teddy Roosevelt, who's a good friend of his. Teddy Roosevelt was another energetic, a lot of devotion to development of the national parks. He just was enamored with the idea. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota is named after him. It's a wonderful place to visit. He even spent time out there after his wife died, just trying to kind of recover some of his mental ability. It really did affect him very much when his wife died. But he was spent some time there, and they named it after him. Muir was one of the first people to theorize that the major landforms in Yosemite were created by large glaciers. And pictured to the right there is Josiah Whitney, professor of geology at Harvard and chief of the California Geological Survey, insisted that they were the result of some other geological process. And so the two of them really began a long-standing conflict. I mean, this was came close to fisticuffs between the two of them. And of course, the idea of glaciers that sculpted Yosemite finally won out because primarily of this kind of evidence. Here you see a glacial trough and half dome to the right there. Glacial troughs are they're a type of valley they're rounded. They're a U-shaped valley. We're going to see a little bit later here the difference between a glacial valley and a V-cut valley. But this one's definitely been cut by a very large glacier. And that's several thousand feet you're looking at. And then, of course, Half Dome was a piece of granite that was split and then fell, and the glaciers, of course, carried it. But that's Half Dome. It's a real icon in Yosemite. All of those rocks that you're looking at in that picture are all a combination of granite and another rock called granodiorite, which is, they're both plutonic rocks. But this is what Yosemite is made of, and they all show, of course, they're very hard rocks, and they all show weathering by glacial activity. Now, secular geology today teaches that the geological process that formed Yosemite occurred over a 100 million year period with granite pushing up and then sculpted by glaciers around 2 million years ago during the Pleistocene epoch that we call today the Ice Age. There again, we're using the framework of small and slow and long ago. Now, here's a man that was involved very much in glacial interpretation, Louis Agassi, father of glaciology, recognized these same features in Europe before he moved here, and of course was recognized as the father of glaciology. And in 1847, that these types of features were originated by glaciers. So I'm not sure why the conflict. This was generally at the same time that things were being worked out with Yosemite. But there you have it. Louis Agassiz, a real proponent of glaciation. So if we look at our biblical framework, how do we put this in perspective? Other than the ages that were held on to by secular geology, the events seem to be right in line. So I would say granite, bedrock, and the foundation of the earth were created during the creation week. And then during the flood, they were uplifted. You can see that going on in Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9, how the mountains rose and the valleys sank down right after the flood. This caused the water to settle in the basins we now call oceans, and then the mountains rising to form barriers all over the earth. One such barrier are in the Sierra Nevadas, and that's where the Yosemite is. Uplift took place as a result of the Genesis flood. Following the Genesis flood, the rapid weather changes began to take place because of increased volcanism. Rapid catastrophic ice buildup following the flood, and then that sculpted the granite, leaving the famous icons that we see today. So just very briefly, it's explained rather nicely by our historical Genesis account. Now, neither one of these views, small and slow and long ago, and big and fast in the recent past, are science. We can't observe these events. They're one-time historical events, but only one is supported by documents and eyewitnesses. The other one is an interpretation, and that's what has carried the day for the interpretation of our national parks. So I think by taking this particular biblical framework, it's just a model of what's there in Genesis, and using this as our template, we can understand the national parks and some of the wonders involved in them. Let's move on to Yellowstone National Park, America's first national park, created in 1872, and the flagship of the national park system. If you can get a job working at Yellowstone National Park, that is the creme de la creme of jobs. And it is very coveted. That is the place to be. It was recognized long ago that it was a result of volcanism. They just didn't understand the type of volcanism, but they did understand the volcanism. And even Hayden reports this in his survey. Somebody commented that if Yellowstone was not a protected park, it would be the #1 toxic waste site on the EPA's list. And the reason being is that it's filled, the hot springs, you can see there, filled with all kinds of nasty chemicals. There are gases that come out of these things, carbon dioxide, of course, sulfur dioxide, lots of acid. Some of the acid in these hot springs reach down to hydrochloric, the strength of hydrochloric acid. There's a lot of sulfur, and it stinks in the park. There's arsenic in the waters, and it's just all around a nasty, nasty place, according to the EPA. But it's protected, so leave it alone and enjoy the ambiance if you can survive it. Now, Yellowstone was really this really came to the attention of Congress when this fellow, Thomas Moran, a very famous painter, 1800s, this is one of his paintings of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And this is one of those paintings that was shown to Congress. And immediately after that, of course, the idea of the national park was born. And it was primarily the result of Thomas Moran and his paintings. Before that, you'd have trappers would come in having seen Yellowstone, and they would describe it in their own inimitable way. And of course, a lot of people would call them crazy fools. But when Thomas Moran showed them his paintings, Congress moved rather quickly. And President Grant signed it into law in 1872. And history was made. The Yellowstone National Park, our first national park. Today, geologists recognized that the processes that formed Yellowstone were the result of at least 3 major caldera-type volcanic eruptions. Now, the word caldera is a Spanish word. It means cooking pot, but it was huge. We're talking about huge volcanic eruptions. These explode and then they sink in and bury tons and tons of rhyolitic lava underneath. In fact, the lava is estimated under Yellowstone to be as much as 3,000 feet thick. That is a lot of volcanic material. And so this really is a result of these big eruptions over a 3 million period, with the most famous eruption taking place around 640,000 years ago. So again, we're using the framework small and slow and long ago. On a map, on a geological map, you can see the outline of the Yellowstone Caldera, and it measures, this is the crater. It measures 40 miles long and 35 miles wide. To give you some kind of idea how big that is, the crater at Mount St. Helens is about a mile wide. So that tells you. And Mount St. Helens was a significant eruption. But it's estimated that if Yellowstone were to erupt today, it would wipe out everything within a 250 square mile area. And all those cities, Billings, and Boise, and Missoula, and a lot of towns in those states up there would just be obliterated by this eruption. Anyway, this was a big eruption, and it left a lot of evidence, but we can recognize the science in the evidence. We know the types of rocks, we know the minerals in those rocks. It's a relatively easy thing to do, and we can recognize this, but the history of Yellowstone was never observed. So it has to be interpreted. The Yellowstone eruptions, this particular one that forms the park, produced over 240 cubic miles of volcanic material. Mount St. Helens produced around 0.24 cubic miles of volcanic material. That is a lot of stuff that's going up into the air and spreading around. Ash from Yellowstone has been recognized as far away as Louisiana and Kansas. There's mountains of it in some of these states. And just sits there, it's weed covered and so on, but it's definitely recognized as ash and chemically with the same signature as the stuff around Yellowstone. The main volcanic rock of Yellowstone is a pyroclastic volcanic rock called tuff. The word pyroclastic means fire broken. So it's very hot ash mixed with bits and pieces of volcanic rock. And this is moving along the ground at hundreds of miles per hour and very hot, 700-800 degrees. And so, of course, as it rolls along, it cools quickly and fuses into this rock called tuff. And it's very predominant in Yellowstone. Another type of rock that is abundant in Yellowstone is a light-colored lava called rhyolite. The word rhyolite means flow stone. Now, rhyolite, many people, they look at this and identify it as lava. They think of lava as a black stuff. Well, there is a black type of lava, but there's also a light-colored lava, and it's characteristic of very explosive volcanoes. Here you can see, these are some of my specimens of rhyolite. They can get very pretty. And you can see why they call it flow stone, because it, in a lot of specimens, preserves the flow patterns. Because it's so rich in quartz, it slows rather slowly. Quartz is one of the things that determines the viscosity of these lavas. And there's a chunk of rhyolite from Mount St. Helens there on the right side of that display. Now, one of the icons in Yellowstone, of course, one of the most visited and one of the most photographed icons in Yellowstone, besides Old Faithful. What is this Old Faithful? It's called Old Faithful because all the people that show up to get their pictures taken. It earned that name way back in the 1800s. But the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone is a wonderful geologic marvel. I mean, it is very pretty and shows up on the postcards and Christmas cards. And when you go there at the right time, you see painters set up and they're painting the landscape. And so it is. It's a wonderful place to see. Now, secular geologists teach that the canyon was cut by the Yellowstone River and is older than the Ice Age, so way older than 2 million years. So they're using the framework of small and slow and long ago. Now here's the main problem, and more geologists are seeing this. If the canyon was cut by the Yellowstone River before the Ice Age, then as a result of the Ice Age, it should look like this. And in fact, this is a glacial trough up in the Beartooth Mountains just north of Yellowstone. It was filled by a glacier, and you can see the U-shaped pattern and the granite that's been smoothed by the flow of the ice. If the canyon was older than the Ice Age, then it should have been cut like the canyon on the left as glaciers were advancing. Instead, you've got this picture. You see the V cut in the canyon? That's indicative of a water cut, a rapidly cut canyon by water. So here's the question. What are we looking at here? Why is the canyon not pink like rhyolite lava, but it's these hues of yellow, rust color, and browns? And why is it V-shaped? Well, if we start putting the picture together, we find out that the rhyolite rock has actually been altered through hydrothermal alteration, which means hot water alteration. Hot water does a number chemically on a lot of things. It can alter the chemical makeup of the rock. It's been altered through hot spring activity and some of the chemicals within the hot springs, some of the acid and so on. And so it begins to look like that piece you see in the foreground of the picture, and produces then a very eroded set of features. It consists, if you look at it aerially, it consists of a big V-cut shaped gash in the rhyolite that is normally very hard rock. Hydrothermal alteration produced the weak rock that was quickly carved, not by glaciers, but most likely by a catastrophic ice dam breach. Very similar to the Columbia Plateau out here in Washington. And of course, the canyon would have eroded very quickly by the water, not over millions of years. And so, instead of seeing the Yellowstone as the cutting tool, we're seeing it really as a remnant of the glacial event, not the cutting instrument. And it's well known that this area of Yellowstone was covered by as much as 3,000 feet of ice during this period of time. And as volcanic activity began to subside, the ice began to melt rapidly, producing all kinds of nasty flooding. And this would have quickly cut into those areas that were weakest, that were the least resistant. And that makes perfect sense with what we see as a V-cut canyon. So if we put it together with our biblical framework, we see this. Yellowstone was most likely a post-flood event, most likely erupted at the end of the flood as the mountains were rising and the valleys sinking down, creating lots of tectonic activity everywhere. Shortly after that, glaciers carved the area, and then through catastrophic ice melting, the flooding produced the now famous Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. All the time as this area was covered with ice, of course, all of the hot springs and the geyser activity and so on was thick in this area, eroding the rock and weakening the rock. So as the ice rapidly melted, it would have produced a flood that would have ripped through this area rapidly, very quickly, and carved the V-cut canyon. Now that's what seeing things from a biblical framework can do to your thinking. But you see, it's a matter of thinking. It's not a matter of science. Science cannot prove whether these things were small and slow and long ago, or big and fast in the recent past. But as a devoted follower of the Scripture, I have to be consistent. And a straightforward reading of the Scripture tells me that Jesus existed and he rose from the dead. I would take the same view toward Genesis. And a straightforward reading of Genesis tells me that the earth was created in 6 days of the day of rest, and about 1,600 years later, a great flood, a global flood, rearranged the earth so that what was before the flood was entirely changed forever, and produced lots and lots of volcanism and erosion, and left our earth in a very, very weakened state. And I get all of that from just looking at our biblical framework. And so this is a major key I want to promote. And just like the secularists have their framework, we have our framework. But it's a good place to start because it is historical. Now, I do have a book called Geology in Our National Parks. It's Lessons in Earth Science, and it takes a look at, I think, 24 parks and monuments and examines these kinds of things from a biblical perspective. I saw it the other day on Walmart for $46.60 plus $4.63 shipping. Don't do that. you can get it from my website for $20.99, and that price includes the shipping. And we'll get it right out to you if you are interested in the book. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that we do offer this year the Yellowstone Creation Adventure Tours, August 22nd through the 26th, and a second one, August 29th through September 2nd. And you'll get practical experience going through the entire park and the bear tooths, interpreting the geology you see using our biblical framework. So with that, I'll close and let Heinz take over here.
Well, thank you, Patrick. One of the questions I was going to ask is, what books would you recommend on the parks? And you have one that covers 20 some.
Well, this particular book here that I showed that one there, Geology in Our National Parks, that's a good study. And then I have another one called Yellowstone Biblical View, and it's a lot more in depth on just Yellowstone. Mm-hmm. Then I have other books that are on volcanism, that kind of give you a background in volcanic rocks and the power processes volcanism. Beyond that, I like to use a book called The Roadside Geology of Yellowstone. And it tells me all of the current secular thinking, mm-hmm. and even some mistakes. I mean, we take kids to an area of the park called Pumice Point. And the book, these geologists say in the book, this area has lots of pumice you can see. And so I tell the kids, if you can find the pumice, I'll give you $20. Well, there is no pumice because, first of all, it's the wrong type of explosion. It's located at the West Thumb Geyser Basin, which was a steam explosion that blew out all kinds of geyserite. So it's not pumice at all, it's remnants of geyserite. But it doesn't take a college degree to see that the science denies the fact that it's pumice. There is no pumice at Pumice Point. And yet I'm not sure why geologists continue to make that mistake. And I'm guessing it's because they send their students out to collect the data, and these guys write the book. I think that's how that works, isn't it?
Yeah.
You went through the process, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway, it is a good book for a lot of great maps and pictures, drawings, things like that.
Yeah.
So those are some books that I would recommend.
There's also one, the Grand Canyon, Another View. You know, that covers the Grand Canyon,
very
of course,
good book.
but
Yeah.
you've read that one. You would.
Yeah, it's a very good book.
Yeah.
You know, there's another book too, if you can get your hands on it. Oh man, now I'm going to space his name. Stephen Austin, yeah, his book on the Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe is one of the best books I have ever read on catastrophism of the Grand Canyon.
Well,
but it's out of print.
Well, he's written one on Mount St. Helens too, of course.
Yeah, he did on Mount St. Helens, yeah. But
Yeah.
that book on Grand Canyon is an amazing book. I just can't find it anywhere.
Yeah. Now, in all three of the national parks that you mention here, you attribute them all to happening, all those forms happening after the flood, or as a result of the biblical flood.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And so you explain that to secular scientists, and what would their reaction be to that?
Science denier.
Science denier.
Idiot.
A Bible denier.
Crazy.
Creation denier.
Yeah, and I understand that, but it wasn't too long ago. I mean, it was just 200 years ago that catastrophism was the view of Earth history. Mm-hmm. And the very famous French scientist, again, I'm just kind of blanking his name, Cuvier, was a catastrophist. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the great scientists of those days were catastrophists. But there's no way to resolve that issue based on science. I think the problem has been that we have taken the interpretations and made them science. And so that becomes the dogma of the day and the consensus. And of course, when you disagree then with the consensus, now you're in big trouble.
You're a science denier.
Science denier,
right.
Yes. But all I'm trying to do is to look at the thing a little bit more open-minded.
Right.
And distinguish the difference between, well, those 4 words I gave at the beginning.
Yeah.
What is history about this thing? What is actual science? And what is the interpretation that's being confused to be science?
Yeah.
Those are very important questions.
So what you're saying is the secular scientists really have no answer.
They have no what? I'm sorry?
They have no answer. They can't explain these catastrophes without catastrophism.
No, they can't. In fact, it's not a real big deal to them. That's why Romer changed the word uniformitarianism to actualism, because uniformitarianism was a very strict adherence to slow and gradual processes and rates.
Yeah.
And it was designed specifically to demolish belief in the flood. And that's what Lyell came up with. And then Romer came along and said, let's redefine it, because we now know there were catastrophes in Earth history. So we observe these, but on a local level. And so we work them into the equation. But you're still dealing with long and slow long ago, big or small and slow long ago.
Yeah. I don't know how familiar you are with some of the creation literature from ICR. For example, one of the things that they give us support for catastrophe, for the flood, for example, is the layers, the multiple layers, and you see an example of layers extending great distances across the whole continent of the U.S. And in some cases, that same layer appears in Europe.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, I think you're looking at, because of the nature of the flood, you're looking at 2 dynamics. There, in some, if you've got 2 parts to the flood, one was the filling stage, and you got a lot of the sediments being churned up and then settling. And there are laws in sedimentation. And sedimentation does settle out according to certain grain sizes. But then you've got the second period of the flood, which is the recessional period, where now all of the water comes off of the earth, and it's carving up all of this mess that was laid down. So you're going to have, in some parts, you're going to have evenly distributed layers that were fairly undisturbed, and others that were ripped up and turned around and redeposited.
Yeah.
So I think that's really the explanation for it.
Yeah. Well, see, again, how would secular scientists explain that? I mean, the fact that this layer, similar layers appear throughout North America and also in Europe. I mean, if it's slow building and all that, how do you explain that?
Well, it's just through disruptions in Earth history, even though some of them are not recorded. This is where the whole idea of unconformities came into play. That if layers that were laid down, evenly distributed all over the place, but there are a lot of interruptions, somebody described it this way. Geology and Earth history was kind of like the life of a soldier. Periods of intense activity followed by periods of inactivity. So in places where you've got an interruption in that flow, you've got plates, they say, in Earth's crust moving around, separating things, stuff disappearing into the sea as they move and so on.
Yeah.
So those are, again, that's interpretation and an idea. I think the best explanation is that the Earth being created as one landmass initially with one sea in Genesis 1, where the flood then erupted and started ripping out the original land mass, redepositing it. The remnants of that one landmass are really today in the form of the continents, surrounded by all the water from the flood.
Yeah. Well, okay, Thank you
Sure.
for that presentation and for the Q&A. So I'm going to just close by bringing up the last slide, if Rick, if you could do that. And just to remind you that we have Chris Ashcroft coming here in February the 26th, and he's going to talk about the wonders of God's creation. You know, because of modern technology, we can see a lot of things that the early scientists could not see 1,000 years ago, things like the microscope and the telescope, and we can see the complexity of nature of what God has created, which Darwin had no way of knowing because they didn't have the microscope and the developed telescopes that we have today. So Chris has been here a number of times. He runs a group called the Apologetics Forum out of Cedar Park Church, and he's a science teacher himself. He teaches science at the different Cedar Park schools. He has a master's degree in biology and also another degree in education, and teaches part-time at Northwest University. He's the founder of Northwest Creation Network, and that's a website that contains a lot of apologetics information, speakers, presentations, you name it. He's got it all in there, including a lot of his own talk. So he'll be here next month, the 26th, which is 4 weeks from now. So for those online, if you're on our mailing list, of course, you'll be informed of that, upcoming meetings, but if you're not, go online to the apologeticsforum.org website and subscribe to our mailing list, and you'll be informed of what's all coming up. And for those that would like to help support this ministry, there is a donate button on our website as well, where people can donate to. We expect from now through to August, we'll have a speaker every month, the fourth Friday of the month, and then we've scheduled 2 speakers to come from out of town in the fall, in September and November, who will be able to speak at a number of different churches in this area, like we normally do with people that we bring in from out of town. So we hope things open up quickly so we can have more active meetings, and we can have people at these meetings, and we'll be able to do our book sales again as well. So again, thank you for your attention. Let me just close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the information that Patrick has shared with us. We thank you for his ministry. He and Vicky have got a great ministry there in geology. They do a lot of training. We ask them just to continue to bless them in that, to reach children, school children, with the message of your creation and the details of that and the evidence that we have for the truth of the Bible. And we thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.